Good afternoon and welcome to our Sunday afternoon video chapel service. My name is Philip Johnson and I have the pleasure of serving as the chaplain here at Good Samaritan Society, Lake Forest Village. And although we still can't be together in person, I'm excited that we get to be together via video this afternoon. Did you know that a horse has an 350-degree field of vision, while humans only have about a 210-degree field of vision? That means that a horse can see almost entirely around its whole head. The only part that it can't see is a tiny section directly behind its head and body. So a horse can see almost the entire 360-degree field of vision. It's only lacking 10 degrees. While humans can only see a little past halfway around the circle of vision. So to about here. That's because horses, their eyes are more on the sides of their head, while for us, our eyes are on the front of our heads. Typically, animals who are hunted have their eyes more on the sides of their head, and it increases their field of vision. This makes sense because if you're being hunted, you want to be able to see what's coming after you. And if you can see more at one time, then you're better prepared if a predator enters your area. But for horses, this sometimes presents a problem. Whenever they're trying to do separate things, it's very easy for them to get distracted because they can see so much. That's why when horses are doing things, we have incorporated the use of blinders. Blinders are pieces of leather or plastic, and they are attached on the sides of a horse's head to their bridle or to their hood, and it eliminates some of that field of vision so that they're only able to see about 30 degrees, only able to see what's right in front of them. So when a horse is racing or pulling a carriage or doing farm work, or even when horses were used in battle, often they would have blinders on, and those blinders would restrict the field of vision so that the horse was only able to see what was in front of them. Now, what does this have to do with our passage? We'll come back to that. I want to read our passage again because it's only a few verses. It's a very short passage, and so I want to walk through it so that we don't miss anything. Again, this is 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 29 through 31. What I mean, brothers, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they had none. Those who mourn as if they did not. Those who are happy as if they were not. Those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep. Those who use the things of this world as if not engrossed in them. For this world in its present form is passing away. Now, I don't know about you, but on first read of this passage, there's some red flags. It seems like Paul is suggesting that those of us who are married live as though we weren't married. So, according to Paul, I shouldn't be married, I shouldn't be sad, I shouldn't be happy, I shouldn't really own things, and I shouldn't really be involved in things. I think that's the danger of a literal interpretation. I don't think that's exactly what Paul is saying here. To understand Scripture well, we have to understand it in its context. So we can't just cherry pick a passage or a verse out of a passage, out of a chapter, out of a book, without having an understanding of what's going on in that chapter and what's going on in that book. So our reading today came from 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians is a letter written by Paul to a group of new Christians living in Corinth, this new church in the city of Corinth. Now, Paul had visited this community when he was a missionary, and he had left, and now they're communicating via letters. An important thing with letters to remember is that letters can serve a number of different purposes. Letters can someone can submit an open letter in which that's meant to be read by lots of people and maybe speaks to a general issue, or letters can be on particular occasions sent to address particular issues. And I think that's what's going on here. If we read through the whole letter, it becomes clear that Paul is addressing particular topics. And in chapter 7, he's addressing the topic of marriage. So we can presume or assume or ascertain that the group of new Christians in the city of Corinth had written him asking about marriage. Now, in Corinth, at the time in history, there was a lot of different ideas swirling about marriage and sexual ethics. And Paul is saying, he's addressing the issue of, I suppose, hedonism, that you can just do whatever you'd like, whenever you'd like, and just completely indulge in the cravings of the body. So he's addressing that. But he's also addressing another philosophy called ascetics or asceticism. An ascetic philosophy was kind of a complete self-denial. And so we have complete self-indulgence and then complete self-denial. And he's addressing both of those things with regard to marriage and sexual ethics. He's saying that marriage is the appropriate container for sexual activity. But that marriage is, in Paul's view, you have to be careful with it. There are certain parameters around it. He begins this long discussion about if you desire to be married, then you should. But in his opinion, marriage was better because of X, Y, Z. And we'll get into that. So he begins in this long discourse about marriage, what it is, what it isn't. And then he arrives at this statement, this passage that we've selected today from our lectionary. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they had none. This is pretty alarming unless you're familiar with Paul's situation and the message he's trying to communicate. So Paul, we believe, is currently unmarried. Now, we don't know if he was married beforehand and perhaps his wife died, or if he has been unmarried his entire life. We can only infer based on certain things he communicates in other passages, because he never comes out and tells us if he was at any point married. But in Paul's opinion, he encourages people to remain unmarried. And the reason for that ultimately being that the person has more time and attention to give to God as opposed to giving to their spouse or their family. Now, I don't think that we are to walk away from this believing that marriage is somehow less than ideal or somehow sinful. I don't believe that we are to walk away from this believing that having a family is somehow less than ideal or sinful. In fact, in Genesis, we are given marriage and family even before we were given the law. And so we can infer from the creation account that the family unit, is something that is good, something that God understands as good for us. In fact, as it's recorded in Genesis, it says that God sees the man, and it says, is not good for him to be alone. And ultimately, Eve enters the picture with Adam, and then not so long after that, they have children, the first family. So I don't think that Paul's statement of celibacy as preference or as preferential or as ideal is to be understood as the be-all, end-all. I think we have to take it with a grain of salt. I think we have to understand it in context. But I also think that this whole discussion of marriage is simply one part of a much larger discussion that Paul is having. Again, let's revisit these passages. So he says, from now on, those who have wives should live as if they had none, those who mourn as if they did not, those who are happy as if they were not, those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep, those who use things of the world as if they were not engrossed in them. So is Paul saying don't ever get married? Is he saying to the Olympic athlete who just won the medal, don't be happy, don't celebrate? Is he saying to the man who just lost his wife or the woman who just lost her husband, is he saying to these people, don't be sad, don't cry, don't miss these people? Is he saying to the young family who just bought a home, is he saying, don't think that this is yours? Is that what Paul is saying here? I don't think so. I think it's part of a much larger point that Paul is making. I'm reminded of the phrase, don't miss the forest for the trees. Now, obviously, a forest consists of individual trees. But in the phrase, don't miss the forest for the trees, it's encouraging us, don't focus on one tree and forget about the forest. Don't focus on one thing and forget about the larger picture. So for us, what is this larger picture? Well, I think it has to do with the first sentence in our passage and the last sentence in our passage. The first sentence, what I mean, brothers, is that the time is short. Last sentence, for this world in its present form is passing away. You see, for Paul absolutely believed, and we can see this in other parts of his writing, Paul absolutely believed that Christ would return again during his lifetime. That Christ would be coming back any day now. That was Paul's posture. That was his anticipation. It becomes really challenging for us to live in that way because we know that that was said 2,000 years ago. And so it's difficult to think that Christ is coming back any moment, that he's coming back any day. It's much easier to anticipate snow here in Dallas, Texas, than it is to anticipate the second coming of Christ. So how do we do that? How do we live in such a way that we are anticipating the coming of Christ? Well, maybe it has to do with those blinders, the blinders that a horse would use. Typically, when we talk about blinders, metaphorically, they're a bad thing. Take your blinders off. You're blind to this. But I think blinders may actually serve a real helpful purpose for us. So for the horse, normally they'd be distracted by a lot of different things going on, but blinders help them to focus, helps them to ensure that they are focused on what is in the center of their field of vision. When they're running the race, what's in the center of their field of vision is the finish line. And if they're running at that finish line, then it helps them not to lean to the left or to the right, not to be distracted by perhaps other horses that are running that same race. I think for us, if we were to employ blinders, then we may not be distracted by things going on in our family, things going on in our job, the million things that I have to fix in my house. That doesn't mean that I completely ignore the house or that the house ceases to exist. It doesn't mean that my family doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that my marriage doesn't exist. It just means that perhaps I'm focused in such a way that it corrects my relationship with my family, how I think about the repairs that my house needs. Again, it doesn't make those things go away, but for the horse and perhaps for us, if we were to employ blinders, it could help us focus on what's really important. I think Paul is encouraging us to focus on Christ, to place Christ in the center of our field of vision. And when we place Christ in the center of our field of vision, it seems to correct our relationship with the other things in our field of vision. And it's very easy to get distracted by those things. You see, when a horse can see everything, it has a tendency to turn its head. And in a race, that would be very bad because usually where your head goes, you go. So without blinders, horse turns its head and it might be running into other horses and creates a whole scene. I remember my mom telling me when I was learning how to drive, keep your eyes on the road. When you have a tendency to look to the left or look to the right, that's typically where you start to turn your wheels. The body follows after what you're looking at. I think for us, if we were to fix our eyes on Christ, if we were to put Christ in the center of our lives, then we're not distracted by the things around us. We are in right relationship with the things around us. And if we're in right relationship with the things around us, then perhaps we can live in such a way that we are anticipating the coming of Christ. And if we are living in such a way as to anticipate the coming of Christ, then perhaps we are also ushering in and inviting in the kingdom of heaven. A reality and a way of life that is not simply after we die, but can be ushered into our reality in our life now. I think that's Paul's encouragement for us today. The time is short, for this world in its present form is passing away. Don't miss what's right in front of you because of everything that's around you. Don't miss the forest for the trees. Don't miss Christ for all the other distractions. Amen.